There is nothing more American than driving down a country road with the windows down, arm hanging out the window like this in a pickup truck. Here in this country, we love trucks so much that it's actually one of the #1 selling vehicles in our nation. We have an entire month dedicated to the sale of said vehicles. Now, while it's extremely common to see a lot of these heavier duty trucks like the F-150 be modified out the wazoo, whether it be a bro dozer or an off-road hauler or an actual work vehicle, there's a number of trucks that often got kind of forgotten about, and truckaminos as well. So today we're going to take a look at 5 potentially good projects that happen to be light duty trucks. Now, as we get into this, I do want to put a caveat out there. You will not find any larger, heavier duty trucks on this list, simply because most of them, if not all of them, are extremely modifiable, have great engines for that purpose, and typically are, in fact, modified to ridiculous levels. And there are also some light duties that are extremely loved and well desired, like the Tacoma and the D21 pickup truck from Nissan. So you won't find anything like that on this list. No, on this list are vehicles that some people honestly forgot were actually trucks. So without further ado, let's get into this. Number 1, the Mazda Rotary. Now, if you're like many people in America who buy the trucks simply for the purpose of having a good utility vehicle, then this was not the truck for you. Now, as the name may imply, this is in fact a Mazda pickup truck with a rotary engine in it. And as you can very well imagine, it didn't do pickup truck things all that well. See, most people when they buy a pickup truck, it's for the point of actually being utility, especially during the era that it was released in. So while the popularity of this style of model was becoming more and more prevalent, Mazda jumped on that bandwagon and unfortunately just did not deliver. Rotaries, as you've probably heard, are not the most torquey engine, and the one thing you want in a truck is torque. So you can haul, so you can carry heavy loads in your bed. Basically, this was more of an enthusiast vehicle than it really was any sort of actual work vehicle. Despite this rather odd setup, it did sell, just not incredibly well. And if you are any bit a car enthusiast, you're very much familiar with the rotary motor and the type of people that are huge fans of it. Getting one of these trucks is not as easy as one would hope because of the fact it didn't sell that well. In fact, there are very few people who are even aware this truck exists, and those who are probably introduced to it through one of a couple ways: roadkill with the Mazda Rotary, or being a rotary fan. As a result, finding one of these and being able to buy one of these is not an easy task, simply because of the fact that rotary people are weird and they like to keep their stuff because they are religious about it. So if you do find one, good luck convincing the owner to sell it. Now, this one might get me in trouble with some of my American fanboys because, well, we tend to glorify its competition a whole lot more than we ever talk about this model, and that's the Ford Ranchero. Ford was no dummy. He knew when he was making cars that he wanted to make cars for the people. He wanted to make cars that people actually needed and would use, and as a result, we got things like the Model T and Model A, which of course were very successful in their own right. But of course, as time moved on, people had more and more needs. Therefore, they needed more and more types of vehicles, such as vans, delivery vehicles, pickup trucks, general trucks, whatever the case might have been. There was always a need for something. And that led to a unique problem where, say, a farmer needs to go into town to sell some chickens, but doesn't necessarily want to bring his truck. He wants to ride in a little bit more comfort and style, but still have the functionality of that. And that is where we get the Ranchero. Basically, it's a pickup truck on a car frame, and most people watching this video will probably go, hey, it's just like an Elko. And that's pretty much because that's why the El Camino exists. Without the Ranchero, the El Camino is not a thing at all. In fact, it was made as a response to the success of the Ranchero. But for whatever reason, they're just not touted as heavily. And to me, as a guy who grew up on muscle cars, it never really made sense why this car was left in the dust so much. There's so much on the table for you to use. I mean, incredibly good styling through almost all of its generations. Typically came with a V8. In fact, some of them came with a Cobra Jet motor. And of course, that lowrider culture, it just, it's so good at it. It looks like it was almost made for it. Now, while all this is well and good, not everyone is jiggy with the whole idea of the rather grandpa-esque styling that this car just brings to the table. After all, the El Camino just had this very muscular, big man on the block kind of styling, and the Ranchero had some of that depending on the generation, but often was more elderly in its appearance, more Buick-ish, not as aggressive as you'd hope for. In fact, I feel like if they had leaned into a little bit more of the Mustang's styling in its design approach throughout most of its model years, it may have actually sold better than the Elco, just because of that whole mental correlation between the two models. As a result of this car being around for quite a long time, there are models all over the place. But finding them is a different task altogether. After all, this is an antique American car. It's not a car that is extremely accessible, if you know what I'm saying. These are types of cars that have a lot of gatekeeping involved, especially if you're of my age. And yeah, that's a thing. The older generation doesn't want to cough up their gold. If you really want a model that is extremely unique and extremely undervalued, look for the GT model. It's quite a different animal altogether in its appearance, and honestly, probably the best looking in my opinion. Alright, it is time to really irritate some people with this next one, and that's the Subaru Baja. Now, I will be the first to admit that this is a car that makes no sense. To put it in the shortest terms possible, it's basically a WRX strapped to a Outback body with the back cut off and replaced with a guarded bed. Subaru Baja. These were an attempt to get into the more truckamino-ish type market, even though it is way outside of its time frame to even try to be a thing on the market. But nevertheless, it still sold, and at a $22,000 starting point, probably not all that well, as you could probably imagine, because this is a very niche vehicle being sold by a company known for its rally heritage, which is what it was really leaning into with the name Baja. But unfortunately, it could not revive the car that's even more famous than other trucks, and that's the Subaru Brat. Basically, the long and short is that this was Subaru's attempt at reviving the Brat name without actually using such a revered and respected name. In fact, this is a vehicle that honestly I feel like more people should get into, because you could buy it as a turbo 5-speed manual. Yeah, it's basically an STI in a truck shell. What's not to like about this? I mean, there's a lot on the table, and yeah, it's not everyone's cup of tea, especially in its styling with the two-tone, and the yellow was a weird color. There's a lot that needs to be helped with this vehicle, but there are some incredibly clean examples of good modified versions. These aren't a car that you necessarily would be found going to church or going to work in, but it's definitely a vehicle that you could have a lot of fun on the weekend with. After all, these can be turned into pretty much anything from, again, that lowridery kind of slammered car to your off-road attempted heritage car. Finding one of these is a little bit of a needle in a haystack depending on your region of the country, but if you do find one, expect to get it extremely cheap, because of the fact that it just wasn't as desirable. In fact, most people who saw the $22,000 price tag probably went, I could use that to buy a Ford F-150, so why would I buy a Subaru? Makes no sense to some people. And as a result, it ends up on this list because it just didn't get the love it needed, and then was also sold at a price tag it shouldn't have. Next up on my list is a vehicle that honestly most of us were probably not expecting. And that's the Volkswagen Rabbit pickup truck. First offered to Americans in 1979, the Rabbit pickup truck is quite a unique animal because it really didn't have displacement. Here in the States, we got two variations of its engine, a 1.6 liter diesel and a 1.7 liter petrol. And as you can guess by that level of displacement, it was not a hauler at all. If anything, this was like your golf cart caddy, which is actually the name that it was sold under in Europe. And of course, as everything goes, the Europeans got much more options when it came to the engine and drivetrain. But the cool thing is we still got a manual here in America, and on top of this, the diesel had a really odd quirk to it, where instead of having fifth gear, it was called the E gear, or economy gear. Cool little fun fact for you. And as you can very well guess just by looking at it, this thing is based off of the Mark I Golf. And quite clearly, not a bad look actually. In fact, these little trucks are quite dependable little vehicles, of course, if you take care of them, but they're just really clean styling. Very, very early pickup truck culture influenced for sure, but it mixed really well with the tuner-esque styling of the Golf. Now, contrary to what you might think, these actually were not incredibly good work vehicles. In fact, they can only haul around 1,100 pounds, which at that point you may as well have bought another utility vehicle at the era. Although one of the benefits of having such a small motor meant that it drank gas through a straw and not straight out the top. So it had some things going for it, but it just didn't sell well here in America, which is why in '95 it was inevitably pulled. And yeah, it didn't have the best sales history, so finding one might be a little bit tough, but they make for extremely clean show cars, and you can make an incredible example out of one of these things into some sort of street clean, even maybe track built car. And rounding off our lists of unusual or unexpected trucks, we have another El Camino competitor, the Dodge Rampage. It's no secret that Dodge knows how to make good trucks. After all, the Rams are still incredibly good sellers, and I see a lot more of them nowadays in my area than I do Fords. But for some reason, the Rampage was a really odd bird. While also known as the Plymouth Scamp, this thing was only sold for about 3 years, from 1982 to 1984, and instead of coming with a nice big old V8 like the Elco had, it actually only had a 2.2 inline 4, which makes you wonder what was going on with Dodge. But then any real Dodge enthusiast will tell you that the 80s didn't exist and the 80s were run by Chrysler instead of Dodge, so yeah. These things had some rather interesting features to them and were also, like the Rabbit, a half-ton pickup truck. It wasn't able to carry extremely heavy loads and was more or less another version of the El Camino. The difference being it came so late in the game that it may as well have never come to the party, with the craze of these vehicles just being at their absolute lowest at this point. While the concept in theory was good, Dodge came so far after the craze of the Rancheros and El Caminos and other sport trucks that it really didn't have the time to develop the platform the way they wanted to, which is why it ended up being an absolute abject failure at the end of its small tenure. And unlike the El Camino's rear-wheel drive, this was only front-wheel drive with a 3-speed auto or a 4 or 5-speed manual. Which, yeah, the manual might have been fun, but with a vehicle of this size, front-wheel drive just doesn't seem like the good answer. And unfortunately, it wasn't. And with the vehicle heavily based on the Charger of its era, being the L body, it had some complicated sales pitching that was going on, and it wasn't working. While it had this very Omni-esque look to it, it could have been so much more, especially if it was all-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive. But instead, they opted for the front-wheel drive. Now, while I know I just spent several minutes dunking on this car for what it should have had and instead actually did have, they're not bad vehicles to try and turn into an even more powerful front-wheel drive setup. In fact, you could take any newer K-Series or B-Series motor, slap it in there, and still have equally as much fun. as this 2.2 liter did. In fact, probably a lot more because of the fact that you'll have real horsepower under the hood. So this would be a very strong contender for a swap job. So editor's note, we actually did a little more digging on the Rampage, and turns out people have done some crazy swaps into these vehicles because they just take the bed out and put a direct, basically almost like a C8 style transmission job in them to make them rear wheel drive. So your possibilities are pretty much endless with these things, and yeah, you should definitely try to get one because some of the stuff people have done is just wild. Check it out. There's a lot of guys on YouTube that are actually doing some cool swaps with these. So without further ado, back to the show. And while only being released for only a couple of years, you can probably find one just because 37,000 of these things were made. So happy hunting. Let me know if you've got one, because I'm very curious what you've done with it, and good luck. And there you have it. That's my list of 5 unexpectedly good project cars that are trucks. Do you agree with my list? Do you think I'm a little off on some of them? Do you think others should be on this list as well? Let me know down in the comment section down below. After all, these are vehicles that are just not commonly seen modified or commonly seen, period. And I think they would make for incredibly good show cars, especially given that the mini truck scene is on its way back. But with all that said, thank you all for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you guys on another episode. God bless, and peace!